remember I'm a pediatric person primarily. However, so I thought it would be totally appropriate to start a little game. So I just want everybody to just go to your neighbor, shake their hand. It's little Simon Says. You remember that? Follow the leader? Okay? And if anybody has a pen, pass it on to the right to your neighbor. Okay? And then pass it back.
Thank you.
And then everybody just follow me for a second. Have a little bit of an itchy nose. Okay? And then I want you to rub your eye. And I want you pondering what I'm going to be saying
I'm not doing anything.
All right, so does everybody know what they really just did? Absolutely. Spread organisms, microorganisms. How many? Probably billions. The good news is no one is really going to get sick, I don't think, from this particular little exercise. Reason being that your immune systems at this point are all intact, and you have the ability to fight off whatever organism you just injected yourself with or infected yourself with. There are those people who do not have that particular ability and actually will get sick. So there's a lot that goes into disease itself, a lot that goes into resistance, and subsequently immunity. But because of our particular position and what we do, there are particular organisms with subsequent diseases that we really do have to pay attention to. So I pulled the important ones out of that chapter that you didn't have to read, that you will read. So you do have to jump on things. So we're going to move ahead, and I will, again, apologize. We just can't get it on. They play with it. All right, so how diseases are spread. You just demonstrated that to the group and to yourself. So we've got these microorganisms, called pathogens, because they're the bad guys. You've got different categories. We have bacteria, and they were about the early ones to be identified because they're larger. And with the advent of medicine and the development of the microscope, which was at the turn of the century, they were able to really identify these. They kind of knew that these viruses, all viruses existed, but really could not be identified because they really couldn't be seen because they were really so small. As medicine advanced, subsequently we were able to identify the different viruses that are out there. There are also fungi or funguses that also affect us, and we have parasites. So you've got all these categories of pathogens. All right? How are they spread? Well, as I said, we just demonstrated. So a lot of it would be aerosolized. I didn't have anybody cough or sneeze. That'd probably be a little bit too gross. I didn't have anybody vomit because that'd be even worse. However, we didn't really share any needles because that's really bad. Didn't give anybody a transfusion. But the common methods of spread include blood, body fluids. Fomites are the objects that you passed around. And some of these viruses are very, very hardy. Just to give you an example, there's a respiratory virus that causes a lot of upper respiratory infections, especially dangerous to our very young. And it is so hardy that it just lives outside the body for almost 24 hours. So it lives on the doorknobs, it lives on these inanimate objects. And these are what we call fomites. In a comparison, your AIDS virus, HIV, is very sensitive and dies shortly after exposure to air. So once again, the pathogen itself and the pathogenicity really varies, and the communicability. And then, of course, we know about airborne, and that's something that's aerosolized and or in touch with secretions. All right, so bottom line, what is it that we do that protects ourselves and protects actually our patients and other patients as we move along throughout the night if you have multiple coughs? What's the biggest thing that we should be doing?
Hand washing.
Well, it'll be gloving first initially. And where did that all come about? What would you believe me if I told you that we didn't wear gloves till about 1982? This is in the hospitals in 1982. We didn't, hopefully we did wash our hands. Hand washing was taught then because we knew about the germ theory. But the advent or the identification of HIV virus was about 1981. And about 1982, when we realized that we'd got a major issue here, and we realized that the population that was initially involved were gay men, unsafe sex, needle sharing. There were other components to that too. There were Haitians that were involved, and hepatitis B was involved there. So once this really came about, it was identified, described, and published in the literature, the concept of universal precautions. And bottom line, that is that we have to assume, even though we know we're not supposed to assume, but we really do in healthcare now assume that everybody that you come in contact with is communicable to you. Everybody's got some kind of disease, okay? So this is where universal precautions came about. So we do put those gloves on, all right? We talk about it in terms of body substance isolation. So there's BSI. And in our EMT class, we drilled it into you. And if you've been in my particular class, what do I always tell you at the very beginning? You know, right? You're going to walk into that room, you're going to take that exam. What's the first thing you do? Hands up, BSI. All right? If you don't, there's your automatic failure. So sophomores, just remember that. Okay? So we're protecting ourselves through the utilization of gloves. The other concept is personal protective equipment, so our PPE. So tell me, what is it that you utilize to protect yourself even further? So gloves, the number one barrier. Let's say it is a trauma, and we anticipate, you see a lot of glass around, you'll anticipate blood. What else might we utilize? What do you have in the pockets of your yellows? You have masks, you have goggles, as well. Absolutely. So we'll don our PPE, and part of that includes our yellows, and part of your PPE, believe it or not, is also your boots in protecting you. So standard precautions involving those three major components. The biggest thing, of course, is hand washing, and you already said that. Anybody remember how often, in terms of seconds? Or, well, maybe I'll rephrase that. What's the best way to really wash your hands to guarantee removal of the organisms? Anybody remember that? It's about 20-25 seconds and running water. And we used to say, you hum, Yankee Doodle. So from start to finish, that'll give you about that 20 seconds. So I want to hear everybody humming when they wash their hands now, you know? Okay, but what subsequently has transpired? We have available to us something that's also very effective in the hand sanitizers. They have alcohol in them. So what they do immediately is kill anything that's on those hands. The only thing they do not do is remove debris. So if you are contaminated with debris, there's actually blood or mud, dirt, anything out there on those hands, you have to wash them with running water. Okay? And there's a certain microorganism in the hospital called C. difficile, C. diff, that'll be up in 599, dare I say that? That's a GI, gastrointestinal organism in stool, and that does require a true hand washing. It's the only thing that our alcohol-based hand sanitizers really won't kill. All right, so it's all about that. There's a reminder here. It seems kind of funny, if you will, but the reminder there in the slide that you can't see does say, remember to wash your hands after gloving. We kind of think, well, we created a barrier. But they actually did do some studies, and it's kind of humorous if you think about it. They have found that because we have a barrier on our hands, there's a reminder that our hands are contaminated, are dirty, and that we really do wash our hands more after the removal of gloves. Think about, there's an element of humor to that. So you're going to wear a barrier, but wash your hands more because of this barrier. When you wash your hands, when you're least likely to wash your hands when you're not using anything. So the studies really supported the fact that, as I said, I find it kind of humorous. Okay. Eye protection gloves, we moved on a little bit from there. The things that we do use, high quality, latex free, they're all safe for use. Remember, don't go for, you have 2 patients in the back, really, you should be changing your gloves in between patients. You get a tear in one, also replace your gloves. Okay? In first aid and in EMT class, we do go through the proper method of removing gloves. Just as a reminder, keeping that in mind, you don't want to contaminate yourself while you're removing your contaminated gloves. And who remembers how to do that? Okay? The one hand slips in, the cuff pulls down part way. Now the clean part removes, picks up and removes so that you're peeling down, and you're going to end up making a ball, and then remove the rest, and then it gets tossed in the appropriate receptacle. All right, so removing the gloves in the correct method becomes important. The reminder here in this particular slide was gowns for childbirth and multiple trauma, and of course, masks. Masks we'll use for potential exposure to tuberculosis. The recommendation is a HEPA filter or an N95, which we do carry. Those are larger particles, and that they really need a better screen for that. All right, so one of the things that we also identify prior to your admission into post is that you are protected against some of the common diseases that you have the potential to be exposed to. And the big one, of course, is really hepatitis, and we'll talk a little bit more about the disease itself. So the series, hepatitis B series, is a series of 3, and we actually give it at birth starting in the nursery now. On here is tetanus, pertussis. Tetanus, you probably received your last tetanus when you were about 11 or 12. You're supposed to receive it every 10 years. There is a recommendation now. The new vaccine has the P in it. We call it Adacel, but it's DTP. It's a diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis to protect you. Anybody know what the P is? What the pertussis is?
Whooping cough?
It's whooping cough, right. What's the issue right now with whooping cough? Anybody know? Some of the parents in the room will know. We've had some outbreaks, little endemic outbreaks of whooping cough in the area. Could be vaccine failure, but the most interesting point is this was a disease that we thought we were all protected about for a lifetime, because even I had that way back when. And what we found that the immunity reached its peak at about age 14, then we began to lose it. So previously we thought we had lifetime immunity to pertussis, we don't. So now they have a new acellular pertussis vaccine that's protecting the adult. So as I said, you probably all had this at about age 11 or 12. The adults have not unless there's a baby in the family, and we give it to the adults now. So they've got to get their pertussis, and it's in terms of Adacel. So tetanus, pertussis, you will all get a tetanus should you ever step on that rusty nail, or should you ever have a major laceration. If it's been within, say, a 5-year period, it's good for 10 years, but in a trauma such as that, we'll all get updated, so to speak. The hepatitis B I mentioned. They also want you to be protected against measles, mumps, and rubella, which are childhood communicable diseases. The interesting thing is, disease today is only if it's a plane ride away. So we have unimmunized children coming in from other countries causing disease. So every now and then we hear about a measles outbreak, mumps occasionally. There was a mumps outbreak in the Hasidic community up in upstate New York, measles outbreak in the Philadelphia area. The problem with, and I won't editorialize too much, the problem with these childhood diseases, they were meant for you to have them when you were a child, not as a young adult, or not going into adulthood. The complications are a little bit more serious in that. So, measles, mumps, rubella, and most of you have all had 2 immunizations for this. There's a 1 and there's a 2. Polio, good news is that's not been around in a long time. It's another kind of a dead disease here. However, it does exist in India and a lot of the third world countries, so polio is around. And what else is back there on that list? Hepatitis A. I added that. It wasn't really in your book, but hepatitis A is the least significant of the hepatitis disease into the viruses causing hepatitis. And it is what you would get from contaminated food. The wonderful thing is, past 5 years, we have a vaccine. So for those of you who like sushi and raw clams and all that kind of stuff, this is a really good vaccine to have, all right? It's a 2-part series, so I have you get one 6 months later, you get the second one. So it's key that you are all immunized coming in to us here as well. I know you have to be immunized for you to enter school. So between kindergarten entry and then middle school and high school entry, these are required mandatory vaccines, except they have A. Okay. And tuberculosis on our list for annual screening because of the potential of your exposure to that. So what is it that we do in the fall every year? We do our PPD screenings. So these are the things that you are already protected against when you really join us, so a good thing. All right, so there are identified for us diseases of concern, and those are the ones in the next 15 minutes we're just going to take a look at. And the big one, of course, is hepatitis B. So what about hepatitis B? Anybody know anything about it? Well, in my days, I graduated in the 60s, and we didn't wear gloves, and a good night in the ICU was blood all over you. Yeah, you really felt good if you did your job and you weren't messing, you know, and hopefully we remember to wash our hands. But a lot of healthcare providers at that time did get hepatitis B, originally called serum hepatitis, and it does affect your liver. It causes an inflammation, and as any inflammation, if allowed to persist, it's going to cause some permanent damage and scarring and interfere with liver functioning. On a positive note, you actually do clear this yourself. There are no drugs for these, really. So there is no drug for hepatitis B, all right? You can clear it from your body yourself. However, there is a percentage, about 30% of people who will go on to be chronic carriers or have chronic hepatitis B. The real danger is not so much right now or as you're recovering from hepatitis B, but the real danger is the effect on the liver in our chronic carriers, in our chronic state, who have chronic hep B, and that is cirrhosis of the liver, which is just destruction, it just damages, the liver becomes fibrotic, cirrhotic, scarred, and cancer. All right, so that's the big issue in the future. Interestingly, the reason that we immunize these babies in the nursery, remember I just said you can clear this, it's self-limiting, it's going to go away in a few weeks, okay? The bad news is this little baby in the nursery who should develop hepatitis B, only 6% can clear it on their own. So they're going to end up with chronic hepatitis, and they're going to end up in the future with perhaps cirrhosis and liver cancer, and then that becomes a person who needs a transplant. So, you know, your biggest reason for liver transplant today is actually hepatitis. So the significance really of hep B, and the younger the child, the less able that child is to clear this on their own. So as I said, the good news, you will. All right, transmitted, so hep B, blood and body fluids, and perinatal infection from mother to baby. What's the real good news? Since there's no drug that will cure this, It's all about prevention. And our success rate with our hepatitis B vaccine has been very good. I was really one of the first back then. At NYU, Dr. Saul Krugman was one of the developers of the vaccine, and I participated in one of the clinical trials. And periodically, I still have titers from 35 years ago. So it's a very effective vaccine. So we did well with that. How do you really recognize it? What's a clinical presentation in this? Well, to fix the liver, what kinds of things might you think you would see? You'd have some GI-related stuff, no appetite, fatigue, things like that. As liver becomes more and more involved, you can have that right upper quadrant pain. But more significantly, the hallmark becomes a yellow tinge to the skin, dark urine, and clay-colored stools. Give you an interesting case. I haven't seen hepatitis in quite a while. But in our office, about 5-6 years ago, a young boy came in and he was just had that blobs, you know, not really feeling well, but not sick enough, really sick. And just on that borderline, most viral infections last 10 days, whether they're respiratory or GI, it doesn't matter. 10 days they're in their body and then they clear. The worst part may be the first 3 to 5 days. So just keep that in mind. You got a 2-week course of illness. Okay, so he's borderline, so maybe he's day 9. But I thought because he was so close to the end, let's just do some blood work and let's just, see. I thought maybe it was a monotype picture. And on his way out, I said to him, oh, do me a favor, Johnny, leave a urine there in our lab, all right? So we had a nurse who was in the lab, and she came out, and she had the urine specimen cup, and it looked like Coca-Cola. Ding, 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 ding. Now, what is this? Okay, add liver studies. So this guy had hepatitis, and it was ended up being hepatitis A. He was at a bar mitzvah, and there was something that was contaminated. I don't recall a particular dish. That's a reportable. That Board of Health gets involved, and this is where they go person to person to person to track with it. So it was kind of interesting. And I kind of keep smiling. I was just old enough to remember and to see because I saw hepatitis, you know, in those early days. Okay. So lasts for a few weeks, improves on its own. Chronic infection, you're no longer you're asymptomatic now, but keep that in mind, the complications down the road. There also is a fulminant kind of a hepatitis that, lucky for us, is really very rare, although it killed a head nurse in our ICU in the mid-1970s, fulminant hepatitis. Okay. What's this hepatitis C, though, that everybody's talking about? Y'all know about B. And now hepatitis C is getting all this hype here. Well, C kind of goes with B. And it's very interesting. They're going back to post-World War now. They think there's a whole lot of people out there with this hepatitis C. Well, the real good news is they're asymptomatic carriers. And it's us baby boomers. So probably a lot of us should be tested anyway. But it's us baby boomers who way back in the 40s and 50s might have had an exposure, have had no symptoms, and we may go on to develop those symptoms later on in life. And right now it does remain to be the most common reason for liver transplant today. Bloodborne also, jaundice, fatigue, dark urine, upper quadrant pain. Symptoms become the same as a more obvious Hep B picture. So it will persist in the liver. About 85% of the patients, once you do get it, its degree of chronicity is higher, okay? There is no vaccine for it. However, we've got some experimental drugs that they can try to manage, and they do some kind of a dual treatment with some drug, combination drug, PEG interferon and ribavirin. And cure rate 50 to 80%, so there's a little bit of good news. But as I said, Hep C is the leading cause of liver transplant. Well, to make matters worse, you know what? Now we have a hepatitis D that we have to worry about. So they're identifying all these other little strains. It coexists only with hepatitis B. So if you have Hep B, you're probably going to have Hep C and D as well. Okay, so more to come, I think, on Hep D as we learn about it so much for hepatitis. So just make sure, right? Wash those hands. Okay, bloodborne. Yeah.
So is Hep D undiagnosed before or diagnosed as a different Hep?
It's diagnosed when they do their studies and draw the blood. They'll diagnose it at the time. Because when they draw bloods for identification, they'll find your Hep D. So it's not diagnosed, doesn't coexist, it doesn't exist separately.
But before they discovered it, it just wasn't.
This is like brand new, this is new, Hep D, D factor, they were calling it initially, so it's sort of, relatively new, yeah.
So John, you said it's self-clearing, Hep B is self-clearing. So if you have Hep B after the 10-day or 15-day period, does it show up at all in any of your blood titers, or do you see
It'll
it?
show up in what we call the sophistication today. They can show up in what they call IgGs. We have ways, the immune globulins. So there's IgA, IgM, which means you have an acute infection right now, and IgG. So I'll be able to tell you whether you did have an old infection.
And you can say the person had
Because
20
you'll
years
have
ago or
circulating
whatever.
antibody, not antigen.
Antibody.
So you'll have the antibodies against it. That's what you get when you get your vaccine. You'll have your antibodies, and that's what we can measure that tells us you've been exposed or had it. And they're so specific today. Is it now, right now, acute infection? Is it a few weeks ago? Are you in a convalescent period? So we can do that, like with mono today. We can do that as well. Yeah. They're probably down to E, F, G, and H by that now too. Yes. There are all these little small subtypes that they're identifying, and that's the thing about viruses. Those particles are so small, and they discover one, and it leads to another one, and leads to another one. So very, very interesting. Okay, so hepatitis. So the good news is you're all protected, but keep that in mind. We're still assuming that your titer level is still good, and protection is good. The other one that's out and about town, and we pay particular attention to, and I mentioned it earlier because we do our annual screening, and that is tuberculosis. We're, shall I say, not in a high-risk area, but you get inner city, or we get into Norwalk sections, or you get into Stanford, certainly in Manhattan, Bridgeport, etc., where the disease would be a little bit more rampant. Tuberculosis has been around a long time ago. It is a bacteria, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It is airborne, primarily does affect the lung. It's got a very interesting pattern to it. If you're exposed as a child, you rarely do get sick, unless you're kind of under the age of 1. Certain things will happen. But you inhale it, and it forms a little spot in your lung. And then it's going to encapsulate, and it's going to probably calcify a little bit, and it just stays there until somewhere in your young adult years, or perhaps adult years, and it becomes more obvious, and you actually develop disease. So exposure in childhood can cause disease a little bit later, but not in the children. So it's kind of rare that we really see active TB in children. If they seroconvert and have a positive PPD, then we know that there is an adult in that household who has tuberculosis. Because as I said, children really don't get tuberculosis. Interesting. Classic, and it's too bad you can't see him, but here's your classic picture of a, it's a kid, of course, but they're just wasted, they're connected. And remember, it's a worldwide problem, and we're not seeing it to this extent. Okay? Fever, cough, night sweats. But it is, remember, aerosolized, airborne. It's on the rise. That current estimation is 1 in 10,000 right now. We've got 2 different stages, primary infection and then latent. So you can get it when you develop the disease initially, or it can develop over time when you're a little bit older. Of concern is that it really just coexists with other disease, and it's in our high-risk group. Even though it's an airborne aerosolized problem, we'll see it in our IV drug users, we'll see it in inner city, you're seeing it crowded. And of course, in any of the third world developing countries, that's a little bit, that's just what you see. Our screening, PPD, and we're looking for a conversion. In other words, we put that little antigen in there, and then when we want to see what your body does to it. So if you have antibody against it, it's going to get raised and red. And what we currently do is if you have a positive seroconversion, we send you for a chest x-ray. If the chest x-ray is negative, you still get treated with INH for 9 months. So positive conversions, even with negative chest x-rays, that's how significant tuberculosis can be. And our other big issue with TB today, I can say we treat you with INH, but the problem is, over the years, these organisms have become resistant to a lot of the antibiotics we use. So we now have multi-drug resistant TB, which in HIV/AIDS patient is really devastating, or anybody with any kind of chronic disease. So TB is absolutely devastating there. Okay, so other disease of concern, which involves bloodborne communication, communicability, sexual activity, unprotected sex, etc., is HIV/AIDS. And that too has been around since about 1981. Anybody know a little bit about that history? It's kind of a very interesting history. Who was patient 0? Now, whether it's really true, yes, the Canadian flight attendant. But recent genetic evidence has demonstrated it originated in West Africa, and it's probably been around since the 50s. However, what began to happen in 1981, and what was really identified, is we had a patient population begin to present with hepatitis B, okay, with TB, and with these so-called opportunistic infections. And what were these opportunistic infections? One was Kaposi sarcoma, which is skin cancer with these lesions. And the other one was pneumocystis pneumonia. It was a specific kind of pneumonia. And these kinds of diseases don't affect anybody with a normal immunity, hence the term opportunistic. So then why were we having this group of people admitted with all these devastating kinds of things? Well, when they began to dig, they realized, well, you know what? There was really something with the immune system that didn't allow the body to fight these opportunistic infections. So things began. It actually was called the gay man's disease because it was found in gay men, in the major port cities also. They had the associated hepatitis B as well, and then it was called the 4-H disease. They didn't know what to call it. One was lymphadenopathy. The 4-H had something to do with Haitians were included in those 4-H's. Heroin, Haitians, I can't remember the other two. It'll come to me. And then eventually they realized, well, you know what? There was some immunocompromise there, and what did we know about it? Determined then what the name was. So the organism itself was identified in about 1985. So we had about 5 years of this before it was ever really identified. And then there are 2 types, HIV-1 and HIV-2. 2 is not as devastating and not as really communicable. And it's all about really viral load. It's kind of a fascinating, disease. And the wonderful thing about today is that we have to realize now it is not the killer that it was at the time it was identified. You wiped out your music industry, you wiped out all your artists, you wiped out your dancers. When you think about HIV/AIDS, HIV is your stage 1, where the virus invades, and AIDS is full-blown when your blood count's really low, your CD4s drop a little, I think it's 200, and then you develop these opportunistic infections. So it's kind of a fascinating disease. The research has been, it's been a worldwide project. The research has gone on. They just had their other big world, conference, clinical trials. They're even working on a vaccine. Okay, so we know in Africa it really is a big problem. The interesting thing is that I think they'll end up with a vaccine sooner or later, but it's no longer the death sentence that it was in 1981. Okay. However, it's not anything that we want. And because it's bloodborne, the biggest risk to healthcare providers is what? That it's your needle stick. And what we've also learned to be a little bit reassuring, you have to have a significant amount of blood on that, like a real scalpel that's got blood on it, and fairly deep and penetrating. And remember I said it dies shortly after exposure to air. So our risk has gone down. We have also gotten better, however. But again, it becomes a lifetime problem, a chronic problem without a cure. So the onus is on us to protect ourselves. All right? So that's a big change. Mother to child transmission is always there. The bottom line, as I mentioned, it just destroys the body's ability to fight disease. Okay? Initial stages that we have, they can get sick initially, and they go on to a dormant stage for about 8 to 10 years, and then full-blown AIDS can occur anywhere after that. So signs and symptoms are the kind that you would think that resemble the flu, and importantly, overall deterioration. I'm just not going to go through that whole list. But the treatment is amazing now. We've got all kinds of retrovirals. They work in the nucleus and the DNA and the RNA to prevent replication, and that's the big thing. So just for an example, if you really had a significant blood exposure, what happens to you is you will be counseled and you are given a cocktail. Not that kind that you drink because you're too young, no. But you're given a antiviral cocktail that prevents replication, and that's the goal. As soon as you have an exposure, and it is significant, and that virus gets introduced in there, you are given drugs to prevent its replication. So you want to eliminate any chance of that virus getting into those cells, and that's why it's very aggressive in that sense. We do that in terms of the last trimester of pregnancy. Pregnant women will get it, and the baby will get treated. Same thing, objective to prevent any more viral replication and to keep that viral load very low. Okay, as I said, the good news too, all our prevention and education is doing its job, and the good news is that it's slow, however, still progressive, but it is manageable. So it's kind of an interesting disease. So I think our risk is really way down now. The book ended, I'm just going to mention for a minute, they talked about West Nile. So we have to say a few words. I just saw an MMR, morbidity and mortality report from the CDC, that West Nile is up 40%. This is last Friday. So there's over 4,400 cases, 130 some odd deaths from it. The good news is a lot of it's all in the south and the west. Texas is the big culprit, but I think Stanford had 2 confirmed cases. So it's kind of out there, and it's about the mosquitoes, and it's about protection. So this is a little virus transmitted by the mosquito. You cannot get it from the patient. Okay, Zach has West Nile, all right? Emma can't get it from Zach. You have to get it from that mosquito. But keep in mind, it affects the central nervous system. So it's a meningitis, encephalitis kind of presentation. So again, put in our book. And what does that mean? That's a fever, that's a headache, that's a stiff neck, that's nausea, that's vomiting. No drug for it, supportive care. It will resolve. But being aware and being on the lookout, higher risk group, senior citizens really seeing that risk. It's kind of a low risk in our pediatric population. Okay. I put in, even though your book didn't have, and this is my plug for this year, the new vaccine is out. We have another new strain added. There's an H3N2 influenza this year that's been identified, so we have a new strain. The new vaccine protects against it. The problem with influenza is that it changes from year to year, and all these subtypes that do exist worldwide. What people do, the scientists get together, they identify where these major outbreaks, what their prediction is going to be, which ones are going to cause disease, and they put it all together into your vaccine. And that's why the vaccines are really yearly. So the good news for all you needle phobics out there is you have intranasal, that's just sniff sniff, that you can get once you're over the age of 2. So there's no shot, doesn't hurt, and it's going to afford you the protection for this particular year. And even though we know you're not in a high-risk group, it just makes you miserable. If anybody had documented flu, it's miserable. That is high fever, that's nausea, that's vomiting, that's lots of respiratory stuff, and you can't get your head off the pillow. So you're really kind of miserable. A little bit of good news, we do have Tamiflu, we have an antiviral, but the thing about our Tamiflu is we have to give it right away within the first 48 hours of a positive influenza A test. We don't just give it to anybody. So once you're confirmed with influenza A, we will give it to you. Relenza, on the other hand, already, our 2 antivirals, is already the organism's resistant. So Relenza, which was a big antiviral, is not effective. It was not effective against swine flu. I had a little bit of humor about swine flu. It's too bad you can't see it, but there's a genetic ability our little kid was kissing the pig. So that's kind of what, all the panic that swine flu generated, because it did originate, and people always, there was some resistance on the part of the vaccine. Oh, I'm not going to get that. That's a new vaccine. And so when this all came about, 3 years ago, H1N1, and when you began to hear all that transpired, our scientists caught up for us, and they developed that vaccine. And people were concerned about the complications of the vaccines. So everybody thought, well, this is a new disease. Well, I'm happy to report that I had the swine flu immunization in 1976. So I went into my office, and since I'm kind of old in there, I said I was the only one who was going to live, and everybody else was going to die, because I already had the swine flu. And everybody knows Dr. Kenneth Becky just said, well, guess you're going to be the only one working, So they might have had some thought that I might have even had some immunity, but obviously was re-immunized. So, you have to think about weighing prevention versus disease. And science has done a lot for us, but we still have people with, some different attitudes about disease. So living through communicable diseases and watching it over the years has been very interesting, and I'm a big proponent in prevention. It's really, it's really difficult in some instances to treat. It's so much easier to prevent. We really just don't want to have these diseases raise their ugly head. And for very interesting reading, and while you're back in school, you probably won't have time, but there's a great book that's called Influenza. It's about the 1918 outbreak that just really killed people, families. My mother told me about this too. They were burying families 2 in a coffin. They just couldn't keep up with this. It was a worldwide, pandemic, if you will. So prevention now that we could do this. So you're all about protecting yourself. Remember, we too have a post-exposure policy. Anything happen, you feel that you've been exposed, you're going to contact. Was Melinda, or was Mrs. Dolliver and Mrs. Dale O'Brien, who's doing OSHA now? And there you go. And Zach first, and he'll go up the chain. So we do have that available for you. Okay. So, well, sorry about the slides on our projector.